Picture this. You're 14 years old, it's before dawn in medieval France, and you're about to witness the most incredible business deals of the 13th century. Not in some fancy castle or royal court, but in a muddy field that's been transformed into Europe's biggest shopping mall. Welcome to the Champagne Fairs, where fortunes were made, friendships were broken, and a single handshake could change the course of history. Today we're following young Henri, a porter whose calloused hands and quick feet are about to take us through one extraordinary day in 1250. By the time the sun sets, he'll have seen more wheeling and dealing than most people witness in a lifetime. But this isn't just about medieval markets and dusty trade routes. The drama, the deals, the absolute chaos we're about to explore basically invented modern capitalism. Every credit card swipe, every online purchase, every business contract you've ever signed traces its DNA back to what happened in these muddy French fields. Before we dive into Henri's world, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. And when you're done watching, drop a comment telling me what surprised you most about medieval business practices. Trust me, you're going to learn things that will completely change how you think about the Middle Ages. Now, let's step back in time to a world where a teenager with strong shoulders and fast legs could witness the birth of international commerce. The rooster hadn't even cleared his throat when Henri rolled off his straw mattress, his stomach already growling for breakfast he couldn't afford. The pre-dawn air carried something special today, though. Mixed with the usual smells of wood smoke and horse manure was the unmistakable scent of opportunity. Exotic spices, foreign fabrics, and that electric energy that only comes when thousands of people gather to make money. The Champagne Fair was waking up, and Henri needed to be there before the first merchant opened his shutters. Competition for porter work was fierce, and the early bird didn't just catch the worm, he caught the silver coins that would determine whether he ate meat this week, or survived on bread crusts and hope. As Henri jogged through the narrow streets toward the fairgrounds, his bare feet splashing through puddles that reflected the first hints of dawn, he passed other workers heading to their daily gamble with fortune. Bakers carrying trays of fresh bread, guards adjusting their sword belts, scribes clutching their precious quills and ink pots. Everyone looked like they were heading to battle, which wasn't far from the truth. The Champagne Fair was economic warfare disguised as a shopping trip. The fairgrounds themselves were something to behold. Imagine if someone took a modern shopping centre, mixed it with a medieval village, and then stirred in enough international intrigue to make a spy novel jealous. Rows upon rows of wooden stalls stretched as far as the eye could see, their colourful awnings creating a rainbow canopy over what was essentially Europe's first multinational marketplace. Henri had been working the fairs for 2 years now, ever since his father died and left him with nothing but strong arms and the desperate need to earn a living. In that time, he'd learned that the Champagne Fairs weren't just markets. They were the beating heart of medieval commerce. 6 times a year, merchants from every corner of the known world converged on this region of France, turning sleepy farming towns into bustling international trade centres. The numbers alone were staggering. During peak season, these fairs could host over 20,000 visitors. That might not sound like much by modern standards, but in 1250, most towns had fewer than 2,000 residents. Suddenly dumping 10 times that many people into a small area created a logistical nightmare that somehow worked like clockwork. As Henri approached the main gate, he could already see the controlled chaos beginning. Merchants were arriving with their precious cargo, each cart loaded with goods that had travelled hundreds or even thousands of miles to reach this muddy field in France. The gate guards were checking permits and collecting tolls with the efficiency of seasoned customs agents, though they probably would have laughed at that comparison. The first lesson Henri had learned about the Champagne Fairs was that nothing happened by accident. Every detail was planned, regulated, and taxed. The Counts of Champagne had turned market management into an art form, creating a system so sophisticated that it would make modern event planners weep with envy. Take the layout, for instance. The fairgrounds were divided into specific sections based on the type of goods being sold. Cloth merchants occupied the prime real estate near the center, their colorful fabrics creating a visual feast that drew customers like moths to a flame. Spice sellers clustered together in their own aromatic quarter, where the air was thick with cinnamon, pepper, and exotic seasonings that could cost more per ounce than silver. Metalworkers had their own section, the constant ring of hammers on anvils providing a rhythmic soundtrack to the fair. Leatherworkers, jewelers, wine merchants, each trade had its designated area, creating a city within a city where you could find anything your heart desired, assuming your purse was heavy enough. Henri's first stop was always the same, the cloth quarter, where Flemish merchants were already raising the shutters on stalls packed with woolens so fine they made his rough tunic feel like sandpaper. These weren't just any cloth merchants. They were the medieval equivalent of luxury fashion houses, dealing in materials that would eventually grace the backs of kings and queens across Europe. Master Willem, a burly Fleming, with hands stained permanently blue from years of handling dyed wool, spotted Henri approaching and waved him over. Willem had been coming to the Champagne fairs for over a decade, and he'd learned that a reliable porter was worth his weight in silver, especially one who could keep his mouth shut about the business deals he witnessed. The relationship between merchants and porters was fascinating in its complexity. On the surface, Henri was just hired muscle, someone to carry heavy bundles and run errands. But smart merchants knew that porters were the eyes and ears of the fair. They moved between different sections, overheard conversations, and picked up gossip that could be worth more than gold to the right buyer. Willem handed Henri a leather cord and pointed to a stack of cloth bales that looked like they weighed more than a horse. Each bale was wrapped in oiled leather to protect the precious fabric inside, then bound with cords and sealed with wax stamps that proved they hadn't been tampered with during transport. The attention to detail was incredible. These medieval merchants had developed quality control systems that would impress modern manufacturers. As Henri hefted the first bale onto his shoulders, feeling his spine compress under the weight, Willem began his daily routine of setting up shop. First came the careful arrangement of fabric samples, each piece positioned to catch the morning light in just the right way. Then the weighing scales, polished until they gleamed like silver. Finally, the counting board, a wooden surface marked with lines and symbols that help merchants calculate complex transactions without needing to read or write. The counting board deserves special attention because it represents one of the most important innovations of the medieval period. Most people couldn't read or write, but commerce required precise calculations involving different currencies, weights, and measures. The counting board solved this problem by turning math into a visual, physical process. Merchants could perform calculations that would challenge modern accountants, using nothing but wooden tokens and a marked board. While Willem finished his setup, Henri noticed other merchants going through similar routines. The spice seller next door was arranging tiny mounds of pepper, cinnamon, and ginger on clean white cloth, each sample carefully measured to show customers exactly what they'd be buying. The metalworker across the way was testing his scales with standard weights, making sure every transaction would be fair and accurate. This attention to fairness wasn't just good business practice. It was survival. The Champagne fairs had developed a reputation for honest dealing that attracted merchants from across the known world. Lose that reputation, and the whole system would collapse faster than a house of cards in a windstorm. The morning rush was about to begin, and Henri could feel the energy building like pressure in a kettle. Soon the fairgrounds would be packed with buyers, sellers, and curious onlookers, all participating in a commercial dance that had been perfected over generations. Money would change hands, deals would be struck, and fortunes would be made or lost before lunch. But Henri had no time to stand around philosophizing about medieval commerce. Willem had spotted a potential customer approaching, a well-dressed merchant whose fine clothes and confident stride marked him as someone with serious buying power. The morning's first deal was about to unfold, and Henri was about to get a front-row seat to the economic theatre that made the champagne fairs the wonder of the medieval world. The customer, a stout man whose gold-trimmed cloak marked him as either very successful or very good at faking it, approached Willem's stall with the careful eye of someone who knew quality when he saw it. His name was Master Bernard, and Henri recognized him as one of the Italian merchants who made the dangerous journey across the Alps twice a year to attend these fairs. What happened next would be Henri's first lesson of the day in the subtle art of medieval negotiation, where a single misunderstood gesture could mean the difference between profit and poverty. Master Bernard ran his fingers through a sample of Willem's finest scarlet wool, his experienced touch reading the fabric like a scholar reads ancient texts. The cloth was soft as silk but strong as leather, the kind of material that turned merchants into millionaires and kingdoms into trading empires. Henri watched as Bernard's face remained carefully neutral, though his lingering touch betrayed genuine interest. The negotiation began with what looked like casual conversation, but was actually a complex dance of information gathering. Bernard mentioned, almost offhandedly, that he'd heard rumours of English wool shortages this season. Willem nodded sagely, while mentally adjusting his prices upward. Meanwhile, Henri stood close enough to overhear every word while pretending to organise the remaining cloth bales. Here's something most people don't realise about medieval commerce. These weren't simple buy and sell transactions. Every deal was a multi-layered chess match involving currency exchanges, credit arrangements, and delivery schedules that could span months or even years. Bernard wasn't just buying cloth. He was essentially investing in Willem's entire business operation. The first real surprise came when Bernard casually mentioned he'd need the cloth delivered to Venice by Christmas. That meant the wool would have to survive a treacherous journey across the Alps during winter, when avalanches and bandits turned trade routes into death traps. Willem's price immediately doubled, and suddenly Henri understood why merchants needed strong nerves along with strong backs. But Bernard had his own tricks. He pulled out a small leather pouch and let a few silver coins spill onto Willem's counting board. Not payment, just a preview of what was possible. The coins gleamed in the morning sunlight, each one stamped with different markings that told their own story of international trade. Some bore the image of the Holy Roman Emperor, others showed the distinctive marks of Venetian ducats or Florentine florins. This is where things got really interesting, because medieval merchants were dealing with dozens of different currencies, each with its own exchange rate that could change daily, based on political upheavals, trade disruptions, or simple supply and demand. Henri watched Willem's eyes dart to a small wooden tablet covered in scratched numbers. His personal exchange rate calculator, updated every morning based on information from the money changers. The haggling that followed was like watching a verbal sword fight, conducted entirely through polite suggestions and meaningful pauses. Bernard would examine a particular piece of cloth and sigh slightly, implying disappointment without actually criticizing. Willem would respond by pointing out the superior craftsmanship of his weavers, his voice carrying just enough pride to suggest he might walk away from the deal entirely. Meanwhile, other customers were beginning to gather around the stall, drawn by the spectacle of a serious negotiation. This was part of the theatre. Potential buyers wanted to see what others were willing to pay, while sellers used the crowd to create artificial scarcity. Henri noticed how Willem kept glancing at the growing audience, using their presence to add pressure to his negotiation with Bernard. The breakthrough came when Bernard mentioned he was representing not just his own interests, but those of a wealthy Venetian guild. Suddenly, the transaction transformed from a simple cloth purchase into a potential long-term partnership. Willem's demeanour shifted from cautious seller to eager collaborator, and Henri realised he was witnessing the birth of what would become a multi-year business relationship. But before any money could change hands, Bernard made an unusual request. He wanted to inspect Willem's entire inventory, including the cloth still packed in sealed bales. This created an immediate problem, because breaking those seals would expose the fabric to dirt, moisture, and potential damage. If Bernard decided not to buy after the inspection, Willem could be left with damaged goods worth a fraction of their original value. Henri watched the two merchants lock eyes, each trying to read the other's true intentions. This was the moment when trust became more valuable than gold. Willem slowly nodded his agreement, understanding that refusing the inspection would probably kill the deal entirely. He gestured to Henri, who began carefully breaking the wax seals on 3 massive bales, each one containing wool that had taken months to produce and transport. The inspection itself was fascinating to watch. Bernard didn't just look at the cloth, he smelled it, tested its weight, even held samples up to the light to check for inconsistencies in the weave. Henri realized this man could probably tell where the sheep had grazed just by touching their wool. Every few minutes, Bernard would nod approvingly or make a small note on a wax tablet he carried in his belt pouch. Other merchants had stopped their own negotiations to watch this masterclass in quality assessment. Word was already spreading through the cloth quarter that Bernard of Venice was making a major purchase, and Henri could see rival sellers trying to position themselves for potential overflow business. The Champagne Fair's information network was faster than any modern news service. Gossip travelled from stall to stall like wildfire, carrying details about prices, quantities, and quality that could influence dozens of other transactions. As Bernard continued his inspection, Henri noticed something interesting happening at the money changers' table across the square. A small crowd had gathered around a heated discussion about exchange rates, and from what Henri could overhear, someone was claiming the English silver pennies were being debased with copper. If true, this news could affect every transaction at the fair involving English currency. Willem had apparently heard the same rumours, because he kept glancing nervously toward the money changers while maintaining his poker face with Bernard. The interconnected nature of medieval commerce meant that a currency crisis in London could bankrupt merchants in France, Italy, or anywhere else within a few days. These fairs weren't just markets. They were the financial nervous system of medieval Europe. The tension ratcheted up another notch when a messenger boy came running through the cloth quarter, shouting something in rapid French that made several merchants look worried. Henri caught enough words to understand that a bridge on the main trade route to Paris had collapsed, potentially stranding dozens of merchant caravans. This kind of infrastructure disaster could trigger price fluctuations across multiple commodity markets. Bernard, however, seemed unperturbed by the growing chaos around them. He finished his inspection, carefully refolded the cloth samples, and turned to Willem with the expression of a man who'd made his decision. What he said next would determine whether Henri would eat well this week or survive on bread crusts and hope. The negotiation entered its final phase when Bernard pulled out his most powerful weapon, a letter of credit from the Bank of Venice. This wasn't just a piece of paper. It was essentially a medieval credit card backed by one of the most powerful financial institutions in Europe. Willem's eyes widened as he examined the document, recognizing the official seals and signatures that guaranteed payment, even if Bernard himself disappeared into thin air. Letters of credit were revolutionary financial instruments that allowed merchants to conduct massive transactions without carrying dangerous amounts of actual coins across bandit-infested trade routes. The system worked because banks in different cities had developed networks of trust and reciprocal agreements that could honor debts across thousands of miles. It was primitive banking, but it worked well enough to fuel the growth of international commerce. But Willem wasn't completely convinced. He asked to see Bernard's personal seal, a small bronze stamp that served as a medieval signature. Every serious merchant had one, and forging someone else's seal was considered one of the worst crimes in commercial law. Bernard produced his seal with a flourish, pressing it into a small bit of warm wax to demonstrate its authenticity. Henri watched as Willem examined the seal impression with the intensity of a detective studying evidence. The design was intricate. Bernard's family coat of arms surrounded by Latin text that proclaimed his membership in the Venetian Merchants' Guild. Willem nodded slowly, recognizing both the artistic quality that made the seal difficult to forge and the institutional backing that made Bernard's promises credible. The crowd around the stall had grown larger, sensing that a major deal was about to close. Henri could feel the electric excitement that came when serious money was about to change hands. Other porters had gathered nearby, hoping to pick up some overflow work if the transaction required additional services. Even the spice seller next door had stopped arranging his samples to watch the proceedings. Willem made his final offer, £200 of his finest scarlet wool, delivered to Bernard's warehouse in Venice before Christmas, in exchange for 12 marks of silver payable through the Bank of Venice. The price was steep, but it included all the risks of winter transport through the Alps, plus Willem's guarantee that the cloth would arrive in perfect condition. Bernard considered the offer for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Henri held his breath, knowing that his own wages for the next several days depended on this decision. Finally, Bernard extended his hand for the traditional handshake that would seal the agreement. But before their palms could touch, a commotion erupted from the direction of the main gate that would change everything. A group of armed men was marching through the fairgrounds, their chainmail glinting in the morning sun and their hands resting ominously on their sword hilts. Henri's stomach dropped as he recognized the colors they wore. These weren't fair guards or local militia. They were soldiers from the Count of Burgundy, and their presence could only mean one thing: political trouble that could shut down the entire fair faster than a plague outbreak. The ripple effect was immediate and devastating. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as merchants tried to figure out what was happening. Some started hastily packing their most valuable goods, while others crowded together to share rumors and speculation. Henri watched Bernard's confident demeanor evaporate like morning mist, his hand frozen halfway toward Willem's waiting palm. The lead soldier, a grizzled veteran whose scars told stories of countless battles, stopped at the fair warden's pavilion and began shouting demands in a voice that carried across the entire marketplace. Henri couldn't make out all the words, but he caught enough to understand the situation was serious. Something about disputed territory, violated treaties, and merchants who might be trading with enemies of the realm. Willem's face had gone pale beneath his weather-beaten tan. Political disputes were every merchant's nightmare because they could transform profitable trading partners into dangerous criminals overnight. Yesterday's trusted business associate could become today's enemy spy with nothing more than a royal decree or a shifted alliance. The cloth merchant looked at Bernard with new uncertainty, wondering if completing this deal might land him in a dungeon. But Bernard surprised everyone by stepping forward with renewed confidence. He reached into his traveling pouch and produced another document, this one sealed with ribbons and wax that proclaimed its official importance. Henri couldn't read the Latin script, but he recognized the papal seal that marked this as a safe conduct pass issued by the church itself. Smart merchants always carried multiple layers of protection, and Bernard had apparently invested in the best diplomatic insurance available. The papal safe conduct was medieval travel insurance at its finest. The church's international authority meant these documents were usually respected even during active warfare, as long as the bearer wasn't carrying actual weapons or military supplies. Bernard's cloth business suddenly looked a lot safer to potential partners, and Willem's colour began returning to normal. The soldiers continued their march through the fairgrounds, but their presence had already triggered a cascade of consequences that would ripple through dozens of transactions. Henri watched a spice merchant frantically covering his pepper samples with cloth, probably worried that exotic seasonings might be considered luxury goods unfit for wartime. A jeweler was quietly sliding his most expensive pieces into hidden compartments, while a wine seller started calculating whether his Burgundian vintages might now be considered contraband. The genius of the Champagne fair system revealed itself in how quickly it adapted to this crisis. Within minutes, unofficial messengers were spreading through the marketplace, carrying updates and reassurances. The fair wardens had met with the soldiers and confirmed that trading would continue normally, provided all merchants could prove their goods weren't destined for enemy territories. It was medieval damage control at its most efficient. Henri noticed how this political drama was actually creating new business opportunities for those quick enough to recognize them. Currency traders were already adjusting their exchange rates to account for potential supply disruptions. Merchants with goods from neutral territories were quietly raising their prices, knowing their products had suddenly become more valuable. Even the letter writers who helped illiterate traders compose contracts were seeing increased demand, as people wanted extra documentation to prove their legitimacy. The most fascinating response came from the Lombard bankers, those financial wizards from northern Italy who had turned money lending into an art form. Henri watched as they huddled together in urgent conference, probably calculating how political instability would affect interest rates and loan terms. These men understood better than anyone that crisis created opportunity for those brave enough to take calculated risks. Bernard used the distraction to his advantage, leaning closer to Willem and speaking in lowered tones that only Henri could overhear. He was offering to increase his payment by half a mark in exchange for immediate delivery of a smaller quantity, 50 pounds of wool that could be loaded onto his cart and transported out of the fairgrounds before any potential complications arose. Smart move, Henri thought. Better to secure a smaller profit than risk losing everything to political upheaval. Willem considered this revised offer while keeping one eye on the soldiers who were now inspecting goods at a metalworker's stall. The sight of armed men examining trade goods was making everyone nervous, and Henri could feel the collective anxiety rising like heat from a forge. Several smaller merchants had already started packing up their wares, deciding that discretion was the better part of profit maximization. The handshake finally happened, but it was a nervous, quick gesture rather than the confident seal of partnership it should have been. Willem and Bernard had reached their agreement, but both men looked like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Henri understood the feeling. Political uncertainty turned even routine business dealings into potential adventures that nobody wanted to experience. As the two merchants began working out the practical details of their transaction, Henri found himself assigned a new task that would take him deeper into the fair's complex operations. Willem needed him to carry a message to the counting house where official records of major transactions were kept. Every deal above a certain value had to be registered with the fair authorities, both for tax purposes and to provide legal protection if disputes arose later. The journey to the counting house took Henri through sections of the fair he rarely visited during his normal porter duties. He passed the livestock area, where the morning air was thick with the sounds and smells of cattle, sheep and horses being evaluated by potential buyers. The animal traders were a rough bunch, their clothes permanently stained with mud and worse, but they dealt in sums that would make cloth merchants weep with envy. Next came the food sellers, whose stalls were already attracting long lines of hungry fairgoers. The aroma of roasting meat, fresh bread, and exotic spices created a sensory assault that made Henri's empty stomach growl with longing. He paused for just a moment to watch a cook turning a pig on a spit over glowing coals, the fat dripping and hissing as it hit the fire. Someday, Henri promised himself, he'd have enough coins to buy a proper meal instead of surviving on scraps and charity. The counting house itself was an impressive wooden building that served as the fair's financial nerve centre. Inside, teams of clerks worked at long tables covered with parchment, quills, and calculating boards. The sound of scratching quills and clicking counting tokens created a rhythmic background noise that spoke of serious money-changing hands at a steady pace. Henri approached the chief clerk, a thin man whose ink-stained fingers marked him as someone who spent his life wrestling with numbers and words. The message from Willem was written on a small piece of parchment and sealed with wax, a formal request to register his transaction with Bernard and ensure it would be legally binding under fair law. The clerk examined the seal, nodded approval, and added the document to a growing pile of similar requests. What happened next gave Henri his first real glimpse into the sophisticated legal framework that made the Champagne fairs possible. The clerk explained that every registered transaction created a paper trail that could be used to resolve disputes, verify payments, or even pursue legal action if someone tried to cheat their trading partners. It was medieval consumer protection at work, enforced by a court system that had evolved specifically to handle commercial disputes. The Court of Piepowders, literally Dusty Feet Court, named for the travel-stained condition of most merchants, was already in session in a large tent near the centre of the fairgrounds. Henri could hear raised voices and heated arguments as he passed by, evidence that not every business deal was proceeding smoothly. The court handled everything from disputes over weights and measures to accusations of fraud, operating under commercial law that was surprisingly sophisticated for its time. As Henri made his way back toward Willem's stall, he noticed how the morning's political drama had settled into a new normal. The soldiers were still present, but they'd shifted from intimidating inspection mode to routine security patrol. Merchants had resumed their negotiations, though everyone seemed more cautious about the deals they were willing to make. It was a perfect example of how quickly the medieval commercial world could adapt to changing circumstances. The walk back gave Henri time to process what he'd witnessed so far. The Champagne fairs weren't just markets. They were complex economic ecosystems where politics, finance, law, and commerce intersected in ways that would influence European development for centuries to come. Every transaction he'd observed was part of a larger web of relationships that connected farmers in England to craftsmen in Italy, bankers in France, to customers in Germany. By the time Henri returned to the cloth quarter, the sun had climbed high enough to burn off the morning mist and reveal the full scope of the fair's activity. Thousands of people were now moving through the aisles between stalls, creating a human river that flowed around obstacles and pooled wherever interesting goods were displayed. The noise level had risen to a constant buzz of conversation, negotiation, and commerce that would continue until the evening closing bells. Willem was waiting with his next assignment, but Henri could tell from the merchant's expression that the morning's events had created new complications. The political uncertainty wasn't going away, and successful merchants needed to adapt their strategies accordingly. What Henri didn't know was that his next task would take him into the heart of the fair's most dangerous and profitable business, the world of international currency exchange, where fortunes could be made or lost with a single miscalculation. Willem pressed a small leather pouch into Henri's hands, the weight of coins inside making a soft metallic whisper as they shifted. The merchant's instructions were simple, but carried the weight of serious consequence. Take these Flemish groats to Master Giovanni at the money-changing tables and exchange them for Venetian silver. Simple words, but Henri had watched enough deals go sideways to know that currency exchange was where fortunes disappeared faster than smoke in a windstorm. The money-changing quarter occupied prime real estate near the fair's main entrance, where every merchant entering or leaving would pass the tables laden with scales, sample coins, and leather pouches filled with currencies from across the known world. These weren't just simple shopkeepers. They were the financial wizards who made international commerce possible, men who could calculate exchange rates in their heads while simultaneously evaluating the silver content of coins from kingdoms most people had never heard of. Master Giovanni's table was easy to spot, marked by a small crowd of merchants waiting their turn, and the distinctive sound of silver coins being tested against a touchstone. The Italian money changer was a compact man whose quick eyes missed nothing, his fingers dancing across counting boards with the speed of someone who'd spent decades turning mathematical calculations into profit. Henri approached carefully, knowing that one wrong move around this much portable wealth could lead to accusations that would land him in the piepowders court or worse. The process of currency exchange was far more complex than simply trading one coin for another. Giovanni examined each of Willem's Flemish groats individually, testing their weight on precision scales and checking their silver content by scratching small samples against a black stone. Medieval coins weren't standardized like modern currency. Each one was essentially a small piece of precious metal whose value depended on its actual silver or gold content, rather than any government guarantee. Henri watched Giovanni's practiced hands work through the evaluation process, fascinated by the merchant's ability to detect subtle differences in coin quality that would be invisible to an untrained eye. Some coins were rejected entirely, their silver content too low or their weight suspiciously light. Others passed inspection but received reduced valuations based on wear, damage, or questionable origins. It was like watching a master craftsman evaluate raw materials, except these materials happened to be the foundation of international commerce. The exchange rate Giovanni quoted made Henri's head spin with its complexity. The calculation involved not just the relative value of Flemish groats versus Venetian silver, but also factors like current political stability, recent trade disruptions, and the money changer's own assessment of supply and demand trends. Giovanni explained his reasoning in rapid Italian-accented French, gesturing toward other tables where different rates were being offered for the same currencies. Competition among money changers was fierce and openly displayed. Each table posted current rates on wooden boards, updated throughout the day as market conditions shifted. Henri could see merchants moving from table to table, comparing offers and trying to squeeze every possible advantage from their currency exchanges. The smart ones had learned to time their transactions carefully, watching for temporary fluctuations that could save or cost them significant amounts. But Giovanni's reputation was built on more than just competitive rates. He offered services that transformed simple currency exchange into sophisticated financial planning. Need to make a payment in London 3 months from now? Giovanni could arrange for a letter of credit that would be honoured by associated money changers in England. Worried about currency fluctuations during a long trading voyage, he offered primitive insurance contracts that protected against exchange rate risks. The transaction proceeded smoothly until Giovanni noticed something that made his expression darken like storm clouds gathering on a clear day. One of Willem's coins bore markings that suggested it might have been clipped. The edges shaved to remove small amounts of silver while leaving the coin's appearance mostly intact. Coin clipping was one of the most serious crimes in medieval commerce, punishable by death in some jurisdictions, and guaranteed to destroy a merchant's reputation if discovered. As the evening bells rang across the fairgrounds and torches began flickering to life in the gathering dusk, Henri found himself walking home with a handful of copper coins and a head full of lessons that would last a lifetime. The muddy field that had buzzed with 20,000 voices just hours earlier was settling into the quiet rhythm of another successful trading day. But the young porter knew he'd witnessed something far more significant than simple buying and selling. The Champagne fairs weren't just medieval markets. They were the blueprint for everything we recognize as modern business today. Every credit system, every international contract, every legal framework that makes global commerce possible traces its roots back to those muddy French fields where handshakes carried the weight of law and a merchant's reputation was literally worth more than gold. Henri had spent one day learning what took centuries to perfect, watching the birth of capitalism unfold one transaction at a time.